as we get into this portion of Romans, this is a part of Romans that, oh, there we go. There we go. Let's see if my new clicker works, huh? Maybe my new clicker doesn't work. Or is it ready where it will work? Should work? Should work. Is it on? It's on. I might have to go back to the old clicker. Do what? Okay. Turn it off. Turn it back on. Ha! You're a genius. That's why I married you, because you were a genius. I knew that right off. We was in earth science class way back when I was like 15 years old. Susie was in earth science class with me, and she just pulled me right through there. I mean, got me an A, and I thought, man, pretty much. I thought, man, I need to marry this girl, you know. Anybody that could get me through earth science, I'm in. So anyway, so I learned about alluvial fans and falling in love all in the same class. It was quite an amazing experience, actually. So now I'm not clicking. There we go. Am I doing that or are you doing that? Not moving. I guess I need to go back to my old one. I broke my old one. Hold on. What? It's moving back here. Oh. Okay. So we get down to, we was talking about God and evidences last time, and about the idea that, you know, there was really no excuse for them not to know who God was and kind of desert that and start making images and doing other things. And I think this thing just doesn't have any range. And and about them doing that, and we get down 24, and we start to kind of, and he kind of starts shifting gears a little bit about this idea of God gave them over to the lusts of their hearts. That's kind of a hard thought, that idea of giving them over to the lust of their hearts. Romans does that to you. You know, that's one thing that always puzzles me about Romans, is that, you know, more than any other book of the Bible, Romans kind of gives this undercurrent, is the best way I know to say it. Kind of this undercurrent of kind of this predestinational undercurrent, you know, that you kind of always kind of got to pull yourself back out of when you're in Romans. It's something that I've always struggled with Romans, and you know, I think it's one of those books. Predestinationalists love Romans, I think, because it kind of gives a lot of that idea, this idea of, you know, things that are kind of set. You know, in other words, we'll get a lot more into this in Romans 9 and 10, but you know, this idea that God kind of abandoned them to it. And that's something that I think we as Christians struggle with, that idea that, you know, of giving up on anybody, or God giving up on somebody. The idea that, you know, he just says, okay, I'm just going to turn them over to it, going to let them into it, not going to stop them, right? But I think that when you think about that a little bit, you know, what could they be stopped, you know? Or was God involved in that? You know, God didn't tell them to lust after that. God didn't tell them to go the wrong way. They decided to do that on their own, and God allowed it. And I think God does that. You know, God allows us to do a lot of things, right or wrong, indifferent. God doesn't necessarily stand in the way physically of us doing something that's wrong. And I think when you, in Paul's mind here, and this idea is that it doesn't make what they did right. In other words, you know, maybe their view of God is a little different than ours, and how that plays out. You know, to them, everything was more or less God related, you know, good God, bad God, evil, Satan, God. You know, Paul kind of puts it to the point here that, you know, that's not true. In other words, they made a decision. God didn't physically stand in their way. He gave them over. You know, what does that mean to you? What does that mean, that he gave them over to it? Mm-hmm. The reason he does this here is because he's leading you into something, you know, and it comes back kind of to this verse. And the reality of this verse is that once you are given over to that, what does that allow you to do? In other words, once you've made a decision that the problem, this is in our world. I mean, this is Christianity today to a large extent. You know, once you're given over to something, once you allow something, once you decide something's okay, you know, we talk a lot about the slippery slope, and there is such a thing, trust me. Once you allow something like that to occur, then at that point, there's no stopping that line of reasoning. Paul is leading you into that idea here. Once you do this, once you're given over to this, once you've broken down that barrier of that, then all of a sudden everything becomes okay. Lusts of their heart, he says here, but, yeah, this thing does not have any range. Lust of their heart, he says here, but now he says they exchanged it, right? And what did that cause to happen? You've broke down that barrier, right? They exchanged truth to God for a lie, worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator. Who's the creature? Who's the creature? It doesn't say that they exchanged the truth of God and worshiped an image, worshiped an idol necessarily, even though he did refer to that, didn't he? He said you've made idols, you've built gods to yourself. But he says you've worshiped the creature. What's that? What's the creature? Other human beings, right? You worship yourself. You worship what you want, what you desire, what fulfills you, not what fulfills God. You've come to the conclusion that, you know, you need to serve yourself. You need to worship man. You need to worship this image. You need to do those things and at that point, you've exchanged that worship to God, and you've broken down that barrier that held you in line, that held you in a and I don't think ethical is the word, but held you in a moral compass. And once you've done that, you've tore that away. This is the most powerful passage in the whole Bible about homosexuality, and everybody always goes to Corinthians, but honestly, this is the most powerful scripture in the whole Bible about homosexuality that you'll ever find. And it's a verse, and we don't talk about it much, right? Because we hate to, because, well, we all know. We know the world that we live in, right? And we see this every single day, and the more we see it, the more all right it is, the less offended we are by it. Would you agree? Doesn't bother us like it used to. We see it in TV shows. We see it in movies. hardly ever anymore a TV show that there's not homosexuality, or movie there's not homosexuality. We see it in front of us every day, and the more we see it, the more apathetic we become to it, the less it even bothers us anymore. We don't think much about it anymore. It just is part of our world. It was part of their world, okay? It was a big part of their world. Homosexuality was huge in Rome. Matter of fact, 13 of the first 14 Roman emperors were homosexuals. So homosexuality was a huge thing. And a matter of fact, in some Roman idea, it was preferable to what was to a heterosexual relationship. So when Paul's writing to Romans, he's writing to a people that are ingrained. This is ingrained in their culture. Well, look at art. Look at Roman art, right? Look at Roman sculptures. Look at all that stuff. This is probably, as much as it's in our culture, it was that or more in their culture. So this isn't something that, this is something they were surrounded with every day. This had become the normal. It was surrounded, just like it surrounds us, it surrounded them every day of their lives. It had become normal to them. And part of when he was telling you he was leading you in, he was leading you in, because when he said they were serving the creature, the lusts of the heart, serving the creature more than the Creator, a lot of this is he was leading you in this idea. You said it. He's serving humankind. We're serving humankind, our own lusts, our own desires, our own wants, our own needs, and we live in a society that propagates that. And we have a lot of reasons that we do that, right? And you've heard the arguments. And unfortunately, a lot of Christian denominations are also, embracing this now. It's okay. It's all right. And that's caused a lot of division too, obviously. So, it's one of those things that we kind of have to address as Christians. We have to talk about, where does God stand on this? The arguments are out there every day. I hear them. Jesus never said anything against homosexuality. Absolutely right. Jews, if you were a homosexual Jew, you probably didn't let it be known. It was, Judaism, God was very explicit about that. They were to be stoned to death, so it wasn't something that Jesus really was concerned that much about. I've heard it said, that's how God created us. If we're created that way, then that's the way it should be. You can't argue against creation. Absolutely you can. It would be no different than a person that was a kleptomaniac saying, you can't prosecute me for stealing because God created me that way, created me to steal. Or somebody that was a pedophile that preyed on little children saying, you can't prosecute me for that because God created me to desire little children. Or a husband or a wife that has multiple affairs on their spouse because God made me where I just can't have one person. Makes no difference. Wrong's wrong, sin's sin. God didn't create us to be who we are. God created us to be who He is. And the day that we forget that, we forget being who Christ wants us to be. And I realize people have different struggles. I understand that. Different things that bother us. Maybe some people are more drawn to things than others and have a tougher time, but I think heaven's the most important thing. I think Jesus addresses that on the Sermon on the Mount, doesn't he? Immediately when he talks about adultery, what does he say? If your eye offends thee, pluck it out. People say, well, you're against homosexuality. No, I'm against sin, and I don't think homosexuality is any greater sin than adultery or fornication or any other sexual sin in the Bible. I think they're all things that are going to send us to hell. And I think we have to preach against all of those things. Sexual sin's a huge thing in every society. It always has been. Our urges, our desires, our wants, our lusts are things that have driven mankind since the beginning of time and will drive us until the end of time. And we desire that and we want it, and we're going to fulfill that a lot of times in ways that we shouldn't. And the Bible addresses that. There's different kinds of sexual sin in the Bible. Homosexuality is just one of those. There's a lot of sexual sin involved in the Scripture. This is probably one of the most powerful And Paul led you into this, whether or not you knew it at the beginning, whether or not you saw it coming. Paul was leading you into this. The idea of serving the creature, the idea that we serve ourselves. God never said, I want you to be happy. You won't find that anywhere in the Bible. God never said that. God never said, I want you to be fulfilled in yourself. God never says that. God says we're to do what God tells us to do, whatever that may be. And, in this case, this is where he broaches that with them, a society that probably has more involved, probably is deeply involved, and not more so than we are in this. And Paul talks about leaving the natural function. And it's this idea, degrading passions. Women exchange the natural function for that which is natural in the same way the men abandon the natural function of the woman and burn in their desire toward one another. Men with men committing indecent acts and receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error. Paul talks about functionality, and I think that's something you can't dismiss when you talk about God. God created everything in this world with function. Now, there's some things I question that about, mosquitoes being one of them. But God did create everything with function, right? And he created everything for purpose. And that's something that is in the very beginning. Matter of fact, the very beginning of Genesis, where it says God created, the word bara is to create functionality. It's to create order out of disorder. God created Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve, right? He created Eve to be a helpmate to Adam, not a partner or a friend to Adam. He created him to procreate, to multiply and fill the earth, which obviously is not the function of a man, or a woman, because obviously that doesn't work. There's a function involved in that, and when they desert that function, when they give over to the passion that's within them, then they abandon the natural function of creation, is Paul's argument here. And that's something that is absolutely true. I think that I know it's a tough subject. I know we get labeled a lot for our stance on that, but it's just one of those things that's going to be what it's going to be. Sexual sin is one of the worst. Paul says, every other sin's committed outside of our body, but that's committed inside our body. And what he means by that is that we, that's a sin that goes probably deeper than other sins, more involved. So this is one of the most powerful passages on this. I don't know there's much else to say about it. I think Paul says it, not Rex. Rex doesn't say it. Paul says it. A lot of people choose not to believe this in Scripture more and more. I think it's pretty undeniable in Scripture, God's stance upon this and upon sexual sin in general. I believe God's stance is pretty straightforward, pretty much is what it is. I don't think there's much way around it. Whether we're talking about homosexuality, whether we're talking about adultery, whether we're talking about fornication, those are the three big sexual sins in the Bible, right? In the New Testament, bestiality in the Old Testament. But that's the big sins. Homosexuality, we all know what that means. Adultery is sex outside of a marital bond, right? We all know what that is. Fornication adultery's, married people that have sex outside of that relationship. Fornication, sex outside of marital bond. We all know, I think we all know what those are. We're all adults in here. And I think this is just a really strong passage. Probably the strongest passage in the Bible, really, dealing with this. So, but Paul's going to continue. Paul loves lists. So, any comments before we move on from this? Right, if we participate or support it. Right. So, I think, that's something we have to, it's something we deal with. And like I said, I think, pornography in general in our society is obviously worse than it's probably ever been in our history, because it's just so available anymore. And we talk a lot about addiction. We talk a lot about drug addiction. We talk a lot about alcohol addiction. Pornography is also an addiction, and it's something we don't talk a lot about. But I would say within Christianity, maybe the bigger addiction than what we would consider drugs or alcohol or other things. It's just something that exists in our society, and it's something that's more and more prevalent in our society. And, obviously we probably don't spend enough time dealing with this, talking about this, preaching about this, because we're uncomfortable with it. We are, and probably rightly so, right? It's one of those things we'd rather not discuss. We'd rather just, push it under the rug, because it is an uncomfortable subject. And but the truth is that it's a very biblical subject. Christ addresses sexual sin multiple times. It's addressed throughout the Gospels. It's in the Old Testament. It's in the New Testament. It's basically throughout the Bible. So, it's a very biblical subject. And I think as much as we like to talk about what's wrong, we need to also preach about what's right. That God did give us an avenue for this. God did give us marriage. He did give us, hopefully, a desire for, somebody of the opposite sex for a spouse, and that, we need to function well within our marriages, and we need to talk about that too. So, it's a big subject, right? And, Paul's not going to necessarily end it. Paul's not necessarily going to end it there. He's going to, I'm going back to my broke clicker. And he's going to, and so he continues on. They didn't acknowledge God any longer, right? To a depraved mind, do those things which are not proper. Probably the biggest problem I have with all of this, and especially, and I think the thing I had the biggest problem with in our society today is that, I understand how the world works. I do, and I see that. But I think what disturbs me more than anything is how this has become all right in Christianity. And I use that word loosely, but there's so many denominations that are embracing this, that are allowing homosexual marriages, that are even allowing homosexuals to preach in the pulpit. Our acceptance of this religiously, I think, is what bothers me more than anything else. I'm all right with the world. Let the world be the world, That's okay. But as it comes into our faith and people begin to look at Christianity that way, I think that's what bothers me. At what point do we abandon what God teaches to be true in order to fill seats? You know what I'm saying? And that's what we do in this world. I'm just telling you. Christianity in America is not about worship anymore. Christianity in America is about filling pews. And it distresses me, That's what Christianity is in this country. To me, that's what it's becoming. Give people whatever they want, do whatever they want, but let's keep the pews full. At what point do we abandon our faith just so somebody sits in a seat? I don't know. I just have a hard time wrapping my head around it. But I think that's where we're at in our world, and it disturbs me greatly. Paul goes on with this, right? He loves lists. Paul's a list guy. He loves lists, right? Unrighteousness, wickedness, greed, evil, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malice, gossip, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, arrogant, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents. Paul loves lists, right? So he doesn't just stop with this. He just goes on into this list of all these things. You know the funny thing in this list to me? Inventors of evil. I don't even exactly know what that means. You know? Solomon says there's no new evil under the sun. Nothing new under the sun. But I guess there is. You know, I guess we can find another way to do it worse than we did it before. And we do, don't we? We do. I tell you, I don't know. Sometimes I wonder why God puts up with us. I really do. I asked myself that this morning. I was going through my news feed this morning. The war in Ukraine, what's happening in Iran, all these things that are going on in the world. And I thought, why does God even put up with us? You know, we're such a mess, aren't we? I mean, we're a mess, aren't we? I mean, we really, really, really are. You know, we have movie stars and sports people that get on TV and tell us we need to save the planet, drive electric cars, and they get in a private jet and take a trip to the Maldives and use more fuel in one day than I'm going to use in my entire lifetime. You know, we destroy our planet, we destroy our people, we kill innocent people every day in the name of all kinds of things. As a Christian in this world, you wonder why God even allows us, why he even puts up with us, right? But he does because he loves us. He loves us, you know, and I think that's in spite of all our problems. When you read this list of people, list of things, you see all the things that are wrong in this world, and yet God still wants us to change. God still knows that we can change, doesn't he? He still thinks we're worth it. For some reason, I don't know why, he still thinks that we're worth it. And that's encouraging to me. But when you look at lists like this and you see all the things that was happened there that have never changed, have they? I mean, it's never changed. Plan evil schemes, yeah. Yeah. And, you know, you wonder, don't you? And Paul says, you know, this is all around you in the world, all around you every day. You know, who are you going to be? And who are you going to be in this world? Who are you going to be in this world? And I think that's really the question. You know, not to be involved in that, not to put yourself over to that. And so he says, huh? Well, I just love them just like everybody else, you know. I don't judge people's life. I try to teach and preach the truth. I don't support people that do bad things, but I have some friends. I have several friends that are that way, and it's something that I would rather they would turn from that. I'd rather they weren't that way, but that's right. Been plenty of liars sitting down in here. There's been plenty of coveters sitting down in here. There's been plenty of unrighteous people sitting down in here. Sin's sin. I mean, there's no greater sin. There's not. I mean, huh? Yeah, they might be looking for that in their lives, you know. So, you know, sin is sin. And, you know, we can never forget that. You know, people say, well, you're just against this. No, I'm not. I'm just against anything that God says is wrong, and I don't care what that is. I don't want you to be a liar or a thief. I don't want you to be unrighteous. I don't want you to be an adulterer or a fornicator or a homosexual. That's true. And I agree. Some sins are more obvious and more visible than other things. 100% agree with that. But, you know, I'm not going to change anybody by hating them. Right, and that's why he goes into that list. He says you can't just look at that. You got to look at the whole range of all these things that are bad. Now, is there a different punishment for visible sin? Yeah, I think the Bible says absolutely there is. If somebody that was blatantly in a sin wanted to come and said, well, I want to place membership here, then there would have to be a change in their lives. I mean, I 100% agree with that. And I think everybody would agree with that. You know, you can't accept that as a group, you can, but you also, you you know, that's what change is about. That's what Christ is about change, about a changed life, a changed lifestyle. If you desire God more than what's wrong in your life or more than the sin in your life, then you're going to change. You're going to turn to that way. But the truth is that on any given Sunday, in any given congregation, anywhere in the world, there's people sitting in pews that obviously, whether we see it or not, or whether it's visible or not, obviously have sin in their lives, right? Regardless of what that is, things we can't even see. I don't know. I don't know what goes on in your life. You don't know what goes on in my life. You know, right? None of us know. Do we? So the truth is that, you know, we come and sit down as an imperfect group of people. We come and sit down as each of us individually in here as people who are not self-righteous. We're people who are righteous because Jesus Christ died for us and shed his blood for us. And you know, does blatant sin need to be addressed? Things that's visible, things that can be seen? Absolutely, absolutely. We have to do that as Christians. But does that mean that you're going to run people off that are just here, that are wanting to learn, that are wanting? No, I don't think you can do that either. You know, you can't do that either. It's not right to do that either. Truth doesn't change. And I wish we could understand that. You know, truth is truth. It's not my truth. It's not Gary's truth. It's not your truth. It's truth. You know, that truth never changes. If you preach that and you stand on that and you believe in that, people who really want to know that are going to be drawn to that. People who want to deny that, as Paul says, are going to deny that. They're going to go off and do whatever they're going to do. You can't stop that. I can't stop that from happening in somebody's life. So our mission on this earth is obviously to present Jesus Christ in the way that the scriptures say we should present him, right? To the world, right? And in order for us to do that, we can't be haters. Would you all agree with that? Jesus was not a hater. He was not. Jesus hated a lot of things. Jesus hated the way a lot of people acted. But Jesus never hated a person. And I think that's something that you have to realize. You're never going to change people by hating people. You're not. You can say, I disagree with your lifestyle. I don't like what you're doing. I don't agree with how you live. But you can never, but if you start to hate them as a person, you're never gonna change them. You know, if anybody could look inside of any one of us, they would find things about us they probably hate. Would you agree? You know, all of us have things inside of us that we suppress, maybe, we deal with, we handle, we get through. But the idea that anybody in here is perfect is ludicrous. I mean, it's ludicrous. We're not. And when we try to point out imperfections in others without looking at the imperfections in ourselves and understanding we all need God's grace, then we stand condemned. I mean, it's that simple. And I think you can't do that. You condemn yourself. Paul's fixing to tell you this very thing that I'm telling you right now. Paul is not going to let you off the hook on this at all, right? They practice such things are worthy of death. They do it, and they give approval, right? In other words, they want other people to do the same thing. They approve it. Doesn't mean that, so you can't approve it, right? You can't approve what they're doing. So he says, well, I know we're about out of time, but I don't want to leave you till I give this, and then we'll come back to this next week. What does he say? In that which you judge another, you condemn yourself. Right? He gave you a big list of things, not just sexual sins. He gave you a big list of things. And he says, when you condemn another, you judge yourself. And I know that's a very quick summary of that verse. We're going to talk more about this verse, talk more about these verses next Sunday morning. But Paul doesn't let them off the hook. He puts him into a place, into an idea that, you know, you have to look at yourself here, right? How do you judge, you know? Now, we ought to talk about judgment, exactly what that means, and we will next Sunday morning. But the point I'm trying to make here is, don't point your finger at everybody else without pointing the finger at yourself and saying, what's wrong in my life, you know? What do I need to change? How do I need to be different? Because Paul doesn't just say, this is a two-way idea here, right? Two-way idea here. And like I said, sin, right? We're going to talk about more next Sunday morning. We're out of time. Probably not the best place to leave this discussion, but I hope that you have mercy on me and that we get to talk about this more next Sunday. Thanks for your time.